This ain't your grandpa's Christianity, that is for sure.
Maybe your grandpa's a badass, who knows?
If this is your grandpa's Christianity, can he come on the podcast, please? Because I want to talk to that fucker. Hello. Welcome to Owls at Dawn. We are just two dudes from Southern California who studied philosophy, politics, and religion around the world and decided to start a podcast where we could bullshit with impunity. I'm Austin Hayden Smith.
And I'm Troy Polidori.
And this week we're jumping into Chapter 2, Part 2 of our new book club series on Daniel Colucciello Barber's On Diaspora. This is a follow-up to the episode a couple episodes ago. I think it was episode 80, where we did the introduction to the text, and then chapter 1 on immanence, and this is going to be a chapter on the concept of diaspora. So stay tuned for that. It's definitely going to introduce you to some themes and concepts in a very unique way, I would imagine. So yeah, be prepared for that. This ain't your grandpa's Christianity, that is for sure.
And if you want to support us, you can go on to patreon.com/owlsatdawn. We have multiple tiers through which you can support us. One tier, the Democracy Motherfuckers, for $2 a month, gives you the chance to vote on a listener-sponsored episode. We had our last one a few weeks ago. We should have another one coming up relatively soon. And
yeah, I think beginning of April, we should probably do another poll for that one. Yeah?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and yeah, exactly.
And you can also support us at a higher level and get access to bonus episodes and our monthly newsletter and naked pictures of Austin, at least some ass, at least, you know? You're offering that, right?
I mean, I haven't been in the gym for the past little while, so they might be older, but, 2018 Austin naked pictures will have to suffice, I guess.
We can even body double you like you're, some famous American actor or actress.
But let's go super extreme with it. Like, put my head on The Rock. And I'm not talking about, like, early Rock when he's WWE, but I'm talking about, like, Hercules The Rock, where he's clearly got some Mexican supplements flowing through his vein.
I don't know, dude. I think you're in Australia. You got to go with one of the Hemsworth brothers, don't you?
I mean, Liam's body would be more kind of, I guess, analogous to mine, but Chris is Thor.
Yeah, I don't even know who Liam is.
He's the dude from you do. It's the dystopian Hunger Games.
That's right. I forgot about that.
He's the one that he's the pretty boy in Hunger Games.
Okay, well there you go.
That she has back home. Yeah. That's
a little bit of you and Katniss. There we go.
Yeah, exactly. And he is Hannah Montana's like fiance or boyfriend or whatever, or off and on. I don't know if they're still together at the moment.
Wow, this is really going down the track of things I don't want to know.
Yes, but go to patreon.com/owlsatdawn and you can get access to that. And as of right now, the newsletter should be out for March. So keep an eye out for that. If you want access to it, head over to Patreon and you'll be able to get that too.
So we should have some new bonus episodes coming out relatively soon as well. So sign up so you can get access to those.
Sweet. All right, man. Well, let's get into the show. So the first thing we got to do is start off the way we start off every motherfucking episode. It's with the Shitty Minute. It's where one of us gets to rant and rave about something that's been pissing us off over the previous week. So, Troy, what's got you down, man?
Okay, so I didn't check on this, but I'm pretty sure, knowing me, that I've done this as a Shitty Minute before. But I think it's okay because we're on episode 82 right now. And at that point, if we start recycling shit, or if you haven't noticed that we've been recycling shit, I haven't noticed. So it's happened. Like, it's for sure happened. It's going to keep happening. If you've listened to 82 episodes of this ridiculous show, then just you get to expect there's going to be some recycled material, right? So we're in the middle of March Madness right now. It just started the weekend that we're recording this right now. By the time you hear this episode, we'll probably have been through the first weekend of the college
upsets will have occurred.
Yeah, fun will be had. No money will be made by people doing the work, and there will be upsets. And there's one common refrain you hear, and I bet you could even predict what I'm going to say here, from people who watch college basketball and get really into
If you start talking shit about college basketball, about how college is better because it's a team sport, is that what you're mad at? Is that what you're mad at?
No, it's not that. Even though that's
Okay.
kind of stupid too.
Okay.
The common refrain, and maybe there's like a constellation of ideas here that are all bad, but the worst one of them is the college basketball is better because they try harder than the
Okay.
professionals is usually the comparison.
Oh yeah, because they're playing for their school and not for the money, so there's some sort of integrity that they have more to it.
Yeah, there's that. I think there's also a subtle, sometimes not so subtle, we like the teams full of unathletic white guys. I'm not going to say it's always has that racial dimension to it, but there's something there, I would think. But anyway, regardless of that, that might just be, armchair psychologizing. I don't want to go down that road. It's the idea that, and I think people are mostly honestly make this mistake. They think it appears as though the college players are playing harder. But here's the thing. They're not. They're just bad at basketball.
Is this the Mark Madsen theory? Like, it looks like he was playing hard all the time, but he was really just a spaz?
Well, no, the thing about guys like Mark Madsen, who was a spaz, and the other guys like that, like Alex
Walton?
Caruso on the Lakers. Luke Walton actually wasn't. He was super chill and more of a skill guy. He wasn't really an effort guy.
Okay.
Although, I mean, he was so unathletic that maybe that was effort. I don't know. But
Because he's when you're really unathletic, it looks like you're a spaz.
yeah, for sure. And there's lots of, kind of unathletic white guys in the NBA who are those like dirt dogs, right? That's a real thing. It's a real trope. Or a trope that's based on some, actual evidence. And the
Kurt
reason for
Rambis,
that,
baby.
yeah, and the reason for that is because if you're unathletic, you're not going to get into the NBA unless you are extraordinarily skilled and or extraordinarily gifted in terms of effort that you can give, which is a skill, right? Certain people have it and certain people don't. And so that's real. The difference here is in college basketball, it's not that they're playing harder, it's that they're playing dumber. And when you play dumb, oftentimes you don't have the focus and the anticipation and the habits, right, built up to just effortlessly do the things that you need to do for your role in the team. So guys just kind of like run into each other, are scrambling after the ball, don't have any direction, so there's more sort of purposeless movement. And that looks like they're playing hard. And they're playing hard for sure. Like, it's not like they're being lazy, but they're not playing well. They're not playing smart. And you can play hard and not smart. And that should be the tagline of NCAA basketball. Play hard, not smart. And so
that's actually a really good T-shirt. Can that be our slogan? Owls at dawn. Play hard, not smart.
I just want, Wisconsin basketball. Play hard, not smart. So here's the thing. Don't say college is better because they play harder. Because it's just not true. But it's still okay to like college basketball. I like it. The tournament's awesome. Part of watching guys who weren't very good at basketball try really, really hard to win at basketball is fun. That's okay, and you can enjoy that. The spastic element to it may be more endearing than watching people who are extremely skilled effortlessly portray their skill or display their skill. I get that, and I enjoy that in fits and bursts too. But don't make it some kind of competition where it's as if college players are playing because they're not making any money, or because they're playing for school spirit, or because it's all about brotherhood. They have this extra dimension of effort that they give, and when you get to the NBA, you make money and you don't care anymore. That's just a really dumb trope that's based on, some psychological tropes that exist and have some truth to them about, how much effort you give when you make money doing something. But that's not at all applicable in this situation for reasons I'm not going to go into right now. But just enjoy college basketball for what it is. It's a bunch of guys who are moderately skilled at a thing, kind of doing it better than most people, but not all that well overall. And they really, really care about it, and so that's kind of fun. It's like when you go watch AYSO soccer with a bunch of 5 to 7-year-olds, and they're all tripping over each other and running into each other and crying, and they really care, and they're really trying hard until they shit their diapers, and then you have to have a timeout and all that kind of stuff. That's fun in its own kind of particular way. It's not because you're enjoying watching, transcendent skill. So enjoy it for that reason.
I have more fun at ASO games than I do at like MLS games, but it's not because the players are better. It's because the environment is more fun. And I think that's the thing, is the environment of college basketball. There is more of an investment in school spirit and stuff like that. And part of it is all surrounding this myth that we have created about the amateur athlete having pride or like some sort of integrity in their athletic output, whereas professionals somehow, because they're getting paid, it contaminates the purity of sport, right? Which is an interesting thing to explore. But I do have a counterpoint for you. Just 2 words. LeBron James. That motherfucker does not play defense. All right? So maybe I have 3 words for you. LeBron James, defense. He is not playing hard. Whereas, if you watch Syracuse, every motherfucker's playing that zone defense as best they can.
You can't play zone defense hard, by definition. Like that's an analytically false statement that you're playing zone defense hard.
No, you have to engage the faculties. You have to be aware, bro. It's not necessarily movement hard, but you have to
move 4 inches a play. Also, I'll respond to your counterpoint with LeBron James not playing defense, which is absolutely true. With every star of every college basketball team, other than a select few guys who are just awesome, like Zion Williamson, don't play defense either, because they have so many responsibilities on their offense, because they're often the only guy on the team that's any good, that they're just hidden completely on defense. Like did you see anything about John Morant from Murray State yesterday?
I know who he is, but I didn't see what happened yesterday. What's up?
Yeah, he had a triple-double. He's probably going to be the second pick in the draft after Zion. That guy doesn't play defense to save his life, which is fine because he's on Murray State and he's the only guy who's any good, and he has to do everything for them.
And he has to score
offense.
40 points. Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, it's the exact same in college, except for the select few guys who are just gifted athletically enough to give it on both ends, which is true in the NBA too.
There's another element to this, though, that needs to be considered that a lot of people sort of forget. And I think it's because we think wrongly, I would say, that playing sports is a privilege, that like these professional athletes should just be thankful that we're allowing them to make millions of dollars because we pay their salaries, right? There's like this strange, it's almost like a social contract kind of theory. Like, well, we don't have the athletic skills to do it, so we allow you, the supreme people, do it, and in return, we pay you money to entertain us. There's this strange sort of like, it is. It's almost like the social contract idea, right? That we've bestowed these responsibilities to these other people, but nevertheless, they still serve us kind of mentality, which I think is wrong. But there's also something to consider that a lot of professional athletes talk about this, that they don't love it sometimes. If you're a professional football player, for example, and you've been playing for 7 years and your knees are fucked and you're tired of traveling and you're tired of kind of living in hotels and maybe you're just kind of like a small town person, but this is your job. You wake up and you do it. There is a sort of mundanity that comes along with professional sports that loses a little bit of that luster. That would also be an interesting foil to add to this idea that kind of goes into why it is that the college athlete plays quote unquote harder. Maybe there is a sense in which they haven't been burdened yet by professionalism. They haven't been burdened yet. But then the other side to that is, but they're also coursework. Some of them are legacies. They're only playing because their parents want them to play or something like that. So there are all these other factors that need to be considered when we're talking about this,
Did you watch the Netflix movie that came out last month, High Flying Bird, the new Steven Soderbergh film?
Oh, no, I really want to, though.
Yeah, I mean, it's super boring. So unless you're really into like the nitty gritty of basketball, which I am, so I enjoyed it, I'm not sure that you'll like it so much, but I think you'll like it for sure. And the whole thing was shot on an iPhone too, which is, he's done that a few times now, and it's pretty interesting. But it's a basketball movie where no actual basketball is played, like zero. Like a guy holds a basketball a couple times, and that's it. But the movie is a lot about this idea that exploring that notion that some of the luster and the passion for basketball gets lost when you involve it in this sort of corporate sphere, right? And that the solution to it is not the sort of college purity model, which is pretty regressive, right? I think we'd all say that. But instead is, what if the players own the teams? What if they actually ran the teams and did it themselves? So a whole different model for how professional basketball is. And so I thought that was an interesting way of kind of agreeing with sort of the diagnosis that you're making, which I also agree with. It's certainly part of it. I think we even talked about this offline. A lot of the NBA stars often talk about their 1 year of college sometimes, where they're on campus for 6 months as being the greatest time of their life. And that's for good reason. Like, there's a lot about that experience that just would be awesome. And you can't replicate that in the professional sphere. But that there's other models that are available than either the sort of regressive work for free, work for passion college model and the professional but corporatized version that is the MBA.
I know we're going kind of long on this, but there's some interesting stuff in this too. Like when I lived in Ireland, one of the things that you kind of just get caught up in is their Gaelic football, which is and then they have hurling, which is another. But they have the Gaelic games, which is this time of the year where all the counties compete in hurling and in Gaelic football, which is kind of like a mix between Aussie rules football. It's kind of like rugby mixed with soccer a little bit. It's kind of hard to explain, but it's really an interesting sport. But they're all amateur athletes, and the entire country comes together. And I remember it was really strange for me. I was like, you mean the athletes get paid nothing? And they're filling out stadiums with tens of thousands of people, especially when you get to the championship, And it was hard for me. I was like, they don't get anything, like not even like kickbacks or free cars or something like that. And I guess like some of the top athletes do. They get good jobs, like they'll get a job at a bank or they'll get a job like managing a car dealership or something like that.
They don't get sponsorships?
The club does. So if you're Kerry, the club does, but all that money goes towards the facilities and towards training and stuff like that. It doesn't go to the players at all. So there are sponsorships, but the players don't see any dividends. But I will say this. There is something amazing about the tradition of these counties all competing with one another. I think there are 32 counties. And then it's also North and the Republic that are all involved in this. And there is something really kind of amazing about it being about kind of both galvanizing the country around this lineage, and they talk about the heroes, and it's like their grandparents. And because they're not professional athletes, these people, not that they're not athletic individuals, but they're not super freaks like LeBron, who's like the Ubermensch, right? Like these are kind of just people that you would know that their grandpa and their grandpa's grandpa are all played on the hurling team, or they all played Gaelic or whatever. And there's something connective about it that isn't corporatized or that isn't commercialized or commodified, that is really lovely. It's just hard because college basketball isn't that way, because it's such a money generator for the universities that it's hard to talk about it in the same sense. So I don't know. I don't really have a point there, but it's just been it was a lovely experience to be involved in for when I was.
No, I'm totally with you, dude. I'm super into the romanticization of sort of regional sports teams and the rivalries that come with that, and the passion of being involved with your local group. But then that passion doesn't become like, wartime nationality or nationalism or something like that, right. Regionalism. So yeah, I love that too. And yeah, I think you're right that the difference with the college sports scene here in America is that that clearly is utilized as in a like bad faith way to make billions of dollars for the NCAA. So it has, even though that I think a lot of people have that true authentic passion for their alma mater's sports team, and that's obviously has nothing to do with the NCAA and their machinations behind the scenes. It's hard not to see it for what it really is, which is weaponizing people's authentic passion to disenfranchise and expropriate money from the workers.
Yeah. What did you say? What's the slogan again?
Play hard, not smart.
Play hard, not smart.
All right, so should we get into on Diaspora?
Yeah, dude, let's do it.
All right, so as Austin was saying earlier in the beginning of the episode, we did the preface in Chapter 1 to Dan Barber's on Diaspora a couple weeks ago. So if you want to go back and listen to that first, if you haven't, certainly that would be a helpful way to get introduced to this, because there's some technical language and concepts used in this book that jumping into the middle of it would be rather difficult, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. Very much so, I think.
So, do you think there's a way to sort of, in retrospect, really quickly review that first chapter on imminence?
Okay, I would say the essential thing that he's trying to do is think imminence. What does that mean? What is imminence? So imminence is oftentimes viewed as either being below transcendence or somehow a derivative of or a degradation of transcendence. And it's this relationship between transcendence and immanence, with transcendence having priority and immanence being sort of secondary, that Barber wants to contest and sort of dissolve, actually, I would say entirely, so that immanence is viewed as this excessive primary concept that in itself is nameless. It is beyond signification. It is beyond capture. It is beyond explanation, determination. He says signification, right? And that is that you cannot determine final or absolute meaning by enclosing it within linguistic systems, but rather immanence is always excessive. And it is excessive in its expression of itself. So there's also a sort of movement of immanence. It's a sort of unfolding. It's a becoming. So not only is it beyond or excessive, or that there's a surplus, but it's also productive. And it's precisely productive because it can't be signified. So there's this paradox with there's always an effort to signify. We're always coming up with systems of meaning, and we're always delineating and determining things. But nevertheless, in our determinations, there's always something more that is scrambling, or that is kind of fraying the edges, let's say, of our significations, contesting them and calling them to pay attention to and to attest to the more than. And so that's what he wants us to be thinking. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and importantly, this is not a kind of negative theology where the namelessness takes precedence. There's not really room for like a mystical silence or like a Wittgensteinian, whereof you cannot speak, thereof you must be silent type of response. Instead, Barber thinks you have to sort of admit to namelessness, but then also admit to the necessity of excessive naming, he calls it, right? Or improper naming. So you actually do have to go out and follow like the logic of determination. You have to speak about things. You have to predicate of objects. You have to talk about the nature of the world, with always the realization that that's going to relay back to the namelessness, right? To the sort of instability at the heart of immanence. I think you used the ping pong analogy, or was it pong analogy?
Yeah, ping pong. Well, but actually both work, but yeah, ping pong is what I said.
Yeah. And the ping pong analogy, you need this back and forth relay, right? So it's not either a mystical silence at the face of like namelessness, nor is it the ability to expound truthfully and accurately upon the nature of the world. It's a relay between both of those. I think the term he uses at one point that stuck in my mind was reciprocal co-constitution.
Yes, I like that. And it's inverting our understandings of causal relations, where generally the cause-effect relation is that somehow the cause has priority, or the cause has some sort of essence in it that is more than the effect, and that there is some sort of discrete separation between the cause and the effect. And the way that he wants to think about the relationship of cause and effect between signification and namelessness is that there's actually this kind of back and forth constitutive relation where signification is constituted precisely in namelessness's or immanence's expression of itself, but then simultaneously there's a reverse causality where immanence is kind of constituted in its articulation of itself, or in its expression of itself. So it's kind of this weird paradoxical understanding of the way these two things relate to one another. rather than it being a sort of linear, sequential A produces B, B produces C. It's kind of A produces A1, and then A1 also goes back, or like A produces B, and then B goes back and produces AB, or something like that. I'm trying to use an analogy here that would make sense, but you can't completely separate them as distinct units. They are integrally related as they create each other.
Yeah, a term that he uses in this chapter, which we'll get to, but I want to just kind of anticipate it now, is he uses the term discontinuity to kind of get again at this lack of stability at the heart of immanence. And I wrote down the phrase, although he didn't say this, I thought it was representative of what he was arguing for, fractal discontinuity. The discontinuity itself is discontinuous all the way down with itself. Yeah. And I think that analogy, if you know about how fractals work, pictured it well for me.
Yeah. And I'll be honest, this is difficult stuff to think through because it is very counterintuitive. And part of the reason that it's so counterintuitive is Barber is clearly drawing from the work of Gilles Deleuze. He actually talks about it in this chapter, I believe, where he says in a footnote that this concept of problematization or the problematic is something that he derives from Deleuze's difference in repetition. And we'll get into that, I think, in a minute. But I think it's important to understand Deleuze's project from the outset, from this book, Difference in Repetition, which was published in it's an older text. It's one of his earliest texts.
Wasn't it based on his dissertation?
First. Yeah, it was his dissertation, but I can't remember if he published it first or if he published another book first before that. But yeah, it's his dissertation. And in it, he's basically overturning the commonsensical notion of the law of identity, that A is equal to A. And Deleuze wants to actually, instead of thinking identity first, he wants to think difference first. So generally now we think of difference as being the differential relation between two identities. So I have a cup on my desk and I have a book on my desk, and they are different insofar as the identity of my cup or the identity of the cup is different from the identity of the book, and that's what establishes their differential relation. So difference is something that is secondary, as it is a description of the relation of the two identities or how they relate to one another. Deleuze overturns that and says, actually, what you have first is difference. Difference is just this field of undifferentiated, unbounded differentiality that is only individuated when we determine the cup to be the cup. Now, of course, there are differentiations between the cup and the book, but nevertheless, that's a second order differentiation that can only be understood once we have constituted them in their identities, which themselves are products of this differentiation process before that. It's super strange, it's super different to kind of think through from how we tend to think of things, but that's where Barber is starting from. And so if you're interested in kind of trying to figure out how to grasp this a little bit more, maybe go to like Wikipedia or something and type in Gilles Deleuze. It's Deleuze and difference, and it might help you kind of grapple with this a little bit more. But it is difficult, and I think actually this second chapter, in a way, kind of helps clarify this notion of difference as being a sort of prior thing through the concept of diaspora. It kind of creates a nice metaphor. It creates a nice signification that I think really helps us to think through what Deleuze is getting at, and kind of then how we can understand Christianity as being sort of diasporic or a sort of differential discourse, don't you think? As a non-Deleuzian?
Yeah, I've always had trouble with that idea, and anybody who's like into analytic metaphysics in the audience will just like get up and throw your phone or your laptop thinking about this. And so I think that this has been, I still don't get it, but I think that this chapter was helpful in thinking about how at least this framing of difference being logically prior to identity could be worked out in thought.
Yeah. Well, cool. Well, then let's get into it, because I said this at the outset. This ain't your grandpa's Christianity. What Barber is doing in this
Maybe
text,
your grandpa's a badass. Who knows?
If this is your grandpa's Christianity, can he come on the podcast, please? Because I want to talk to that fucker. So in this chapter, Barber wants to look at the concept of diaspora. He talks about it in chapter 1, that he wants to think the concept of diaspora. He's not looking so much at the historical or sociological fact of diaspora, even though there is a sense in which he's abstracting from that, right? Especially when he talks about Yoder, and a little bit he quotes, there's a passage where he's talking about sort of the experience of Jewish diaspora in the ghettos. But that's kind of all in service of this larger theoretical project. So the first thing I want to say is that there's a quote that leads this chapter in, and the quote is from Jesus, and it's, "If you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? Do not even Gentiles do the same?" And
That
the
was
reason
one of
he
the most
uses,
fire lines in the New Testament, by the way.
oh God, yeah, right? Like, oh, big deal. You greet your brothers and sisters. Doesn't fucking everybody do that? Like, you think that makes you special? I love that. That's how that would be the Twitter version, right? That's so snarky.
Are you saying that Jesus would have owned on Twitter?
Oh, dude, he was so snarky, man. Are you kidding me?
Yeah, the Sermon on the
way
Mount,
that,
dude. Oh yeah.
oh, but the way that he talks to the fucking Pharisees and the Sadducees.
Oh yeah, my
he's
God.
so
Whitewashed
snarky.
tombs, you snakes.
Like, oh really? You guys think you're badasses? God. Yeah. So the reason that Barber starts off the chapter with that quote is because he basically wants to talk about what he sees as being this a tension, right? And people see this tension all the time, and it's the tension between the Christian declaration of the gospel, which is the good news, and then the sort of historical enactment of that declaration, and that they're, you know, you hear this all the time. It's like, well, the evangelical church isn't really Christian. True Christianity is just doing X, Y, Z, you know? And then, so some people are like, therefore we need to reclaim some essence of Christianity. So you have like the social gospel movement that is sort of like trying to reclaim the ethical aspect of Christianity. You have that stupid Bible that Thomas Jefferson put together where he just like cut out all the peripheral stuff and just reduced it to an ethic, right? Like supposedly
yeah,
that's
cut out all the miracles and stuff. Yeah.
yeah, cut out all the miracles and stuff. And
When we were in school, there was the Ancient Future Faith movement.
What's
was
that
the
one?
idea. Don't you remember that book, Ancient Future Faith?
No.
It was part of the emergent church stuff.
Okay.
The
I don't
idea
remember.
was, reclaiming the early church, house churches, no institutions. It's about ethic of responsibility and care and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
How'd the
Yeah. I mean,
segue look?
I fall into this trap a lot of times too. You know,
It's hard
even
not
though I
to.
don't, it's very hard not to, because you do look at the early church and you're like, Jesus, well, what the fuck happened post Constantine, right? So that's what a lot of people like to do. They like to say, it was when Constantine legalized the church, and then his grandson, is it his grandson Theodosius in 390, makes Christianity the state religion and bans paganism. That's when the institution of the church comes in, and there's this enclosure.
That's such a bad marker, dude. Like fucking bishops were murdering people and stuff before that ever happened.
Right. And so there is a romanticism that people are often trying to kind of get, or they're often perpetuating by trying to go back to like the truth of what Jesus really was doing, right? And Barber is not doing that. That's not what he's interested in doing. He's interested in doing something very different. He's interested in thinking through what are the conditions of possibility that make that dissonance, that maybe paradox or that inconsistency between the declaration of the gospel and its historical enactment. What makes that possible in the first instance, right? That's what he's thinking through.
Yeah, so he's thinking more about the existence of a form of thought, more so than a historical contingency, such as the church becoming corrupted or something like that.
Yeah. It's like what allow for that conflict, what allows for that conflict to emerge in the first place is kind of it, right?
Yeah, and not the historical conflict, but the conflict in thoughts.
Right. And his argument is that it's because Christianity has a lack of a concept of diaspora, is what he means.
Yeah, that kind of seems like the whole negative side of the thesis of this book, I would think, right? Before we explain what diaspora is and what its value is, that's the positive side. The negative side is what are the effects, the negative effects of not having this concept of diaspora.
Yeah, and the negative effects are a sort of thinking of transcendence, I think, is what he would say, right? That I think he would ultimately say that thinking diaspora is a thinking from immanence. And when Christianity does not think diasporically, it's because it's enclosed within a logic of transcendence. One of those four paradigms that he talks about in the first one, probably the theological ontology or the theological particularism one.
Right. And so you may have good and sort of better or worse versions of that, right? Like I think certainly the ancient future faith stuff is very authentically held and largely driven by people who want to do what's right and care about what's good, and they really care about, the sort of reputation of Christianity and its mission in the world and all that kind of stuff. Certainly better than I don't know, the monolithic Catholic Church or right-wing evangelicalism in America. But still, I think Barber's point is going to be they have to rely on transcendence, and that's why you have this counterposition between the authentic Christianity as it's declared by Jesus, and then the sort of failure in Christian practice to meet that declaration's standards. And that's going to handcuff you as far as actually not sort of instantiating an authentic Christianity, because Barber's just rejecting the very idea that there is an authentic Christianity.
Right.
But it's gonna bar you from something effective.
Yeah, I mean, because he's not in any way trying to assert some sort of orthodoxy. He's not interested in that at all. Rather, what he wants to do is he wants to think of Christianity as a type of thought that is deterritorializing. It's that, the reason he wants to do this is because he's like, I want to see what we can do with the Christian tradition that we have necessarily inherited, rather than just discarding it like the radical new atheist types want to do and just say, oh, it's just a sort of degradation of human rationality and it's bullshit mythologizing and whatever else that they want to say about it. He doesn't want to go that route. And he's also not trying to say, no, guys, hold on, we just need to reclaim some sort of truth about it. But rather, let's do something productive with the concept of Christianity per se, or with the regime of Christianity that sort of avoids either of those two, that avoids condemnation or the desire for salvation of Christianity itself. And so that's what he wants to do. Thinking of a diasporic Christianity is kind of thinking or imagining new ways to work with what Christianity is. So there's also a level of pragmatism here, I think, that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, and I think that frame also helps really think about why we would care about this, or why anybody in the audience who doesn't have a dog in the fight about that's a terrible analogy, by the way, I shouldn't use that, doesn't have skin in the game. Is that even better, skin in the game?
I don't know.
When it comes to Christianity, right? What if you just don't give a shit at all about Christianity? Well, right. There's some sense in which, if you're, at least in the Western world, culture is itself in some sense Christian, even if it's post-Christian. Post-Christian is different than being non, or extra Christian or something. It's different than if you grew up in Hindu India or something. So there's some sense in which you have to deal with Christian thoughts in some way, or else you're really just sort of repressing it.
Yeah, this is kind of there's a nihilism if you try to just simply reject it and say, well, fuck, why are we talking about it at all? Let's just ignore it. That's like an otherworldly, naive nihilism, because you're actually rejecting the world as it is constituted. And the thing is, when you think immanently, you sort of affirm all of the significations that are at your disposal, right? He calls it, what is it, the host community or something like that? What does he call it? The host site or something like that? But let's say the host site of our future and present significations are influenced by Christianity. To try to simply just neglect them or reject them or push them aside as them being completely inconsequential is really to neglect sort of foundational and integral constitutive elements of the world in which we live, right? Especially in a world of American cultural export, where the Christian ethic and the Christian motif is something, or Christian motifs plural, let's say, is something that is exported through the internet and through capitalism and through certain cultural trends that you can't ignore now. Like, even if you go into, East Asian communities, there's a sense in which some type of Christianity has influenced them. So there is a globality to Christianity that we have to accept, for better or for worse. And I think for Barber, he's not interested in making that normative, actually, for better or for worse idea. He kind of wants to move beyond that idea and kind of affirm that it is the case, and then say, so what can we productively do within that frame? And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, I think that there'll be some sense in which retroactively, when we see what his conclusion is here, especially in this chapter, it'll make more sense why there's no reason to talk about the better or worse.
Okay.
That question sort of goes away when we get into this idea of diaspora. But yeah, we'll come back to that. I want to talk a little bit about this discontinuity, rupture, and apocalyptic.
Yeah, I think that's for me, that's the most fascinating part of this chapter.
Yeah, so discontinuity, Barber says, he says that Christian declarations, so like the mission of Jesus, and we didn't say this, but he sort of really quickly summarizes, what would take thousands of years of biblical exegesis and exposition to determine, and there's still many debates over. Christian declaration is essentially the end or the sort of erasing of vertical hierarchies of power, and then the horizontal friend-enemy distinction. So he thinks these kind of two poles are where the Jesus declaration exists, right? Criticizing the powers. We saw that obviously a lot in Paul too, which I think we'll get to in the next chapter. And then also the bringing together of groups horizontally. And so the quote you said at the very beginning about don't the Gentiles also love their brothers and sisters? How special are you if you do that? This call to love your enemy is not just about sort of throwing hot coals on someone's head, right? But instead about collapsing the sort of difference between horizontally associated groups. So this idea of discontinuity, then he says, the Christian declaration of these of this collapse between vertical and horizontal relationships, it's not only discontinuous with the world's form, because that's usually how these sort of returns to the early church and whatever form they come in are usually about that kind of discontinuity, right? The Christian declaration needs to be a small, isolated, non-institutional, decentralized sort of critique of the world's powers. And all the different forms of it come like that, because that was the way that the early church was, right? Especially you read the Pauline epistles. Those are about these small, isolated groups being persecuted, trying to find ways to exist in a complicated world full of different political forms and social forms and all that. And they have a challenging message and a challenging example to the world, right? But Barber says it's not only that kind of discontinuity with the world's sort of extant form, but it's discontinuity with itself overall. And that's the difference logically prior to identity thing that you were talking about from Deleuze earlier. It's like a double discontinuity or or an auto discontinuity. And that's where it's, I think, harder to really conceptualize because it's so different than these typical forms of Christianity that you see.
Yeah. Christianity is viewed from Barber's perspective not simply confronting the powers of the world, but it's also confronting itself. And there is this scrambling. So this goes to that co-constitutive relation of immanence that we were talking earlier. If there's a cause-effect relationship, let's say between the Christian declaration and the world, the typical Orthodox way of viewing this is that somehow the essence of the Christian declaration is issuing from God, which is the cause of it, right? Like there's all this language of like the Bible being breathed out and Jesus being the Word and the Logos and these ideas that sort of seem to indicate the transcendent causal relation that Barber confronts in the first chapter by sort of not transforming, but deforming is actually, he uses this idea because it's not a transformation, it's a deformation actually of the causal relationship, where what's taking place in the declaration is something that also has a feedback upon itself in the declaration, in the contestation of the powers of the world that also contests its own, let's say, eminence, right? So it's not a position standing outside from on high that is separate from or that is preeminent to, but that itself is immanent in its sort of contestation of the powers that kind of like rebounds back on itself and reorients itself. And so it is responding to, it is deriving its impetus from the world, confronting that status or the codes of the world that it is deriving its status from, while simultaneously being deformed in that process of contestation. Which
Yes.
Some people would just be like, well, then what's unique about Christianity? That's not even Christianity. All he's saying then is it's just like this deterritorialization. And in a sense, yes. In a sense, he isn't trying to preserve any sort of orthodox understanding of Christianity, because the orthodox understanding of Christian discourse is precisely thinking from transcendence. It is, of those four paradigms, it is either theological particularism or the theological ontology. And it does not think this way. This is a completely radical way of thinking about what Christianity could be, or what we could do with it.
And, one thing I was thinking reading this, and to make the point that you're making a little bit more explicit, he didn't say this, but it's something that came to mind as I'm reading this. Wouldn't the claim also be that, especially from the Jewish tradition where diaspora comes from in the first place, there never was or never is an authentic form of thoughts, and whether it's religion or in politics or whatever, there is no original authentic thing that sort of is stable across time and never evolves. That just doesn't exist, and probably can't exist if you're taking the really kind of radical Deleuzian framework, right?
Right.
Like there's no sense in which Abraham's ritual practice with his family is in some way still the kernel of like First Temple Solomonic Judaism, and then Judaism in diaspora in Babylon, and then the Second Temple. Like there's continuity in terms of temporal continuity and whatnot, but there isn't some kernel that exists throughout all of that, which is sort of safely held and only on the margins is adjusted for context. And the same would be true of Christianity, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think you're right. Okay, with regards to this issue then of continuity, rupture, and apocalyptic, so I also was thinking a lot about sort of, let's say, atheistic or secular interpretations of Christianity, like someone like Alain Badiou with regards to the rupture idea. And then also people like Karl Barth, right? And I think this matters because I think one of the other things is, okay, so if Christianity can be viewed as this disruption or this diasporic or discontinuous declaration, how is it that we understand it as something novel? Or how do we understand it as being either transformative? He actually wants to say it's not just transformative, it's deformative, but we can get to that later. But how do we understand the uniqueness? Like, what is it then? How do we understand Christian declaration emerging out of its context? And there's been like a lot of popularity because of Alain Badiou of trying to think of like this, the event as being something, and this is obviously for political purposes too, that Badiou wants to think about, that the event is something that kind of is almost this supernatural thing that comes from completely outside the world. It is otherworldly. And Barber wants to think of the Christian event, let's say with quotes around it, in a way that isn't otherworldly. It isn't something that comes from without. It isn't something that is derived from, let's say if you have an enclosed sphere, for example, or circle, and that's the world. Christianity isn't something that comes from outside that erupts into it and that transforms that world, that breaks it open. That would be a sort of Karl Barth or maybe an Alain Badiou kind of understanding of the event. It is this thing that is completely other that erupts the world. That's the rupture theory of the event. He wants to think of it as being apocalyptic, which is very different. What did you think about this part of?
Yeah, so this was definitely the part of the chapter where I was most sort of quizzical, maybe, I guess you could say.
Okay.
So he seems to countenance rupture as being very much a transcendent notion. He literally says rupture in some sense is a notion or follows a logic of transcendence. And that he prefers this notion of apocalyptic, which I don't feel like he ever actually defined it in contrast with rupture. I kind of tried to read over this section a couple times to see if he gave any sort of contrast, but I myself at least didn't see it. Okay. And my concern was that I agree that the notion of of rupture following a logic of transcendence is very problematic and often is used by sort of more fascist political ideologies and whatnot. And that's certainly, I think, not something we want to use or a logic we want to follow. But that irruption, if I'm getting my terms right, irruption is when something erupts from within, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's eruption and there's irruption, and one of them is from within, and one of them's like a rupture from without. Like if you stick a knife into like a bag full of air, right?
Yeah, IR eruption. IR eruption is what he's talking about. Eruption is like a volcano.
Yeah, exactly. And so my thought was that, you've read more Badiou than me, so you need to correct me. I haven't. I read Logics of Worlds like 12 years ago, and understood 10% of it at best. But for Badiou, isn't the notion that the level of transcendence or from which the event comes is not from without; it's actually from within, right? That's why he uses the picture of ontology as being mathematics, because he wants to take this idea of the empty set, which exists in every set, as being that kind of locus from where the event comes. Is that not, in some sense, the kind of eruption as opposed to irruption?
So there's a shift in Badiou a little bit from being an event to Logics of Worlds. In being an event, he speaks much more about the event as being like supernatural. And he actually uses that word, that it's kind of a supernatural event that is radically other, that comes into the world and completely reorders the world. In Logics of Worlds, and then this will be a callback actually to our book club on Prozorov, there's a sense in which the event is a sort of a dissolution of the transcendental coordinates that make up the significations of a given world, right? And so it has more of a sort of imminent causal relation that I think Barber would find attractive. But at least in being an event, it seems more, or maybe at least in the reception of it, and definitely in the Badiou book, in the Paul book that Badiou writes, the event is viewed as being a supernatural thing that is completely other, that is that idea of rupture that I think Barber wants to get away from. So if we're going to say, and he doesn't mention Badiou in this chapter, but he mentions him in the previous chapter, so I kind of felt like he was intimating that Badiou is kind of like this thinker of rupture. At least, maybe that was just my projection, but it felt like that.
Yeah, and to be fair, I think Logics of Worlds came out in 2009. This book came out in 2010, was it?
I feel like this is like his PhD dissertation too, or like a
so you probably hadn't had any familiarity with Logics of Worlds yet.
I'm thinking, the book I think was written maybe in the French, but I don't know. Maybe it wasn't. Oh, no, you're right. It came out in like 2009 or something like that in the French. So, yeah. And it wasn't even translated until after. No,
it was in English because I did a seminar on it in 2009.
Oh, was it? Okay.
Yeah, so it was it had just come out when we did the seminar. It was like brand spanking new. So, yeah, I think there are other notions of rupture that and apocalyptic that could escape part of Barber's criticism here. And I'm personally really drawn to them. I don't want to go too far on this, but I'm personally really drawn to those notions. And I'm glad you brought up Prozorov because that's definitely my thinking as well, because there's a clear sense of universalism there, right? Because the empty set, the nothingness is universal in everything. It's already there. The material's ready to go. And so that becomes, for me, that's much more attractive for reasons which we've talked about ad nauseum on this podcast. But I do wonder, and we can maybe come back to this later. I want to try to focus a little bit more on what Barber's trying to do. That could be I don't want to say like a Damocles sword because that's way too strong of a claim, but that could be like a little something on his shoulder that we're going to have to come back to at certain points.
Yeah. So I think one way of trying to understand what he does mean by the apocalyptic or by apocalyptic is by trying to understand what he's distancing itself from, by understanding what rupture is, and then by understanding how he articulates continuity. So continuity is a sort of like, let's say there's a consistency, right? That there is some sort of things kind of just continue along the way that they've already been going.
Or identity is consistent over time, kind of an idea.
Right. And then rupture is that there's some sort of like radical disruption from without. And apocalyptic doesn't mean either of those things for him. In this sense, he says that apocalyptic is radically futural, whereas neither continuation or continuity, let's say, or rupture are able to really think apocalyptic in the way that Barber wants to, because they're not able to really kind of reconcile with time as being this sort of breaking of continuity, but that is imminent, not something that radically comes from without. And yeah, so I think that that's kind of important to understand. And I think you said that you didn't quite get a grasp on how he defines apocalyptic, but it's primarily because apocalyptic for Barber, and this is a difference between the event in Badiou and the event in Deleuze. Apocalyptic for Barber is, I think, analogous to what we might call the actualization of the virtual, or the event in Deleuze, or the sort of paradoxical reorientation of forms. And this goes back to something he mentions earlier, where he talks about the sort of form as being problematic. And this is where problematization and the problematic in Deleuze comes in. And this is where it gets all a little bit weird again, and kind of difficult to understand. But I read the apocalyptic in clearly Deleuzian terms. So for me, for you, you said that you didn't quite think that he kind of defined sufficiently enough for you the apocalyptic. Whereas for me, it jumped out the page as being Deleuze's notion of the event versus Badiou's notion of the event, which relates to all of these other explicitly Deleuzian concepts. So for me, I was doing a lot of mental work in my own head. That if you aren't familiar with Deleuze's project or how he kind of formulates his concepts, that it might have been difficult. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. So I get this notion that apocalyptic is radically futural, right?
Right.
And what I had in mind there, although he doesn't say this explicitly in this section, so I was wondering if maybe it was just implied, is back to this, what was the term he used for it? The reverse causation?
Yeah, reverse causation. Or reverse causality, yeah.
So is the notion of apocalyptic being futural really just a callback to this reverse causation thing, where this apocalyptic future thing has reverse causal effects on the now? Is that basically the idea?
That's part of it. And then it also we need to understand this in the concept of the relationship between expression and constructivism. And then I think we also need to understand this as being sort of separate from or distinct from any sort of teleology. There is no telos as well, right? So it's futural, but it's a futural that is radically futural. That is radically thinking the novel or the new, but from an immanent frame, because it is a transmogrification of the very coordinates that condition the world as it presently is. But it's not completely outside of it, because all there is immanence. So it's still, in a way, is fueled by immanence, but apocalyptic doesn't exist within the significations that are presented or determined, but rather is the manifestation of the excess of immanence. It is that which is always beyond signification. It is the realization or the actualization of the unthought, or of the surplus of immanence that is always existing at the margins beyond signification. And that's what makes it different from like a Badiouian event. Deleuzian event is always there, but in virtual form. And it's the transition from virtuality to actuality, the transition from the scrambling of the codes to new codes, that is what defines a Deleuzian event, and I think what defines apocalyptic. Does that make sense?
Is the notion for Deleuze then not just that everything is an event, whereas for Badiou it's a very rare, specific kind of thing?
Events for Deleuze are ubiquitous. Yes. Yeah. That's exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. That makes sense as a contrast between the two visions, and that makes sense of the apocalyptic then, because when I think of apocalyptic, I think of this very specific genre, specifically of biblical texts. Whereas he's not referencing that specific kind of like genre of thinking or genre of theologizing or philosophizing. He's thinking more about taking the apocalyptic mode and just saying, actually, this is how all thought works. Is that not the case?
Well, he's kind of, again, he's thinking, what are the conditions of possibility that allow for apocalyptic thought to emerge in the first place, right? And he talks about that in the relationship of covenant ideology. So he's looking at, 3rd century BCE, and he's saying there was this emergence of apocalyptic expectation. What is it that caused that anxiety, where all of a sudden apocalyptic becomes the sort of regime that frames Second Temple Jewish thinking? That there were these expectations, these heightened expectations for the Messiah. And he says it's precisely because of the failure of covenant ideology, which was the idea that God is in control of everything. I thought of it as like a failure of theodicy in a way, right?
Yeah,
like
I thought the same thing, for sure.
Yeah, and because of that failure, anxiety is induced. And the reason that anxiety is induced is because that's the sort of the margins of signification, or let's say the gaps in the margins of signification are being penetrated by immanence, which is always excessive, which is always productive, which is always there, which is always calling us to kind of acknowledge it, which is always scrambling the codes of truth in our political and social and economic lives. And so what are the conditions that created apocalyptic anxiety in the first place is really what he's interested in thinking. And it's precisely because of the excessiveness of immanence. So for Barber, apocalyptic isn't simply the apocalypse, which is the singular event towards which future is moving, which is like the revealing of the truth that once and for all has always been there, but we just didn't have it shown yet. But rather, apocalyptic is the kind of conditions of possibility for scrambling the codes of reality that make up our world.
Yeah, I was thinking as an analogy, for our own sort of political, ideological location today, we could think about the sort of declaration, like American declaration, versus the American failure to sort of perform on that declaration, right? Everything from freedom to liberty to specific kind of American socialization or whatever. All those things together have a certain promise to them, right? A certain life that we can live individually and as a community, which has clearly in many ways failed, right? And that anxiety of the failure of theodicy that you were talking about, that kind of same experience seems to be happening today, right? So you can kind of map that onto, not that Americans live in diaspora the way that Jews in Babylon would have been, but there's some sense in which a similar experience of the failure of theodicy might be the case, and so you can kind of map this politically today. And I think that's kind of running through, or at least going to be running through a lot of this book at some point, given what Barber said in the first chapter about getting to where we are today as sort of a goal.
Yeah, I was thinking about it too, also within any sort of discourse that has some sort of inconsistency. I was thinking about with communism, right? Like the declaration of communism versus the sort of historical enactment of it. Like that's it. You could also do a similar sort of investigation with that. You could do a similar investigation with capitalism. The supposed the declaration of capitalism, and then of course the kind of enactments of capitalism. There are ways to kind of apply this this strategy, I think, to various other fields. Yeah, there's actually part of the reason too that I really love this notion of the apocalypse that he develops is that it really has a lot of resonance with the work that I do in my book that's coming out this summer. On Sartre's critique of dialectical reason, because the notion of the apocalypse factors heavily in Sartre's critique that he derives from Malraux, and that actually Badiou derives from Sartre. And so there is this interest in exploring this notion of the apocalypse in different ways. And I kind of side with the Deleuzian sort of reading of apocalypse as being something that is ubiquitous. And I talk about the difference between the Badiouian conceptions of the event and Deleuzian conceptions of the event, but I'm really fascinated with this idea of the apocalyptic as being a sort of dispositional reorientation to the world, that transforms both our subjective constitution and the world as they co-constitute one another. And for me, that is precisely what I develop when I'm in my book talking about the creation of society as a work of art. It is this co-constitutive relation that transforms the world in our creation of ourselves and vice versa, the creation of ourselves in our transformative creation of the world. So I love this immanent relation, this co-constitutive causal relation that helps us understand apocalyptic as being this diasporic, deterritorializing orientation within the world that disrupts the world, that deforms the world, but that isn't coming from a sort of foundational primary position. Because if it did, then it would fit into probably the regime of philosophical delimitation that he talks about in chapter 1, which is the idea that everything that can be said and talked about, it has like a circle driven or written around it, and then philosophers kind of like stand outside of it, and theology is always looking over the shoulder, or anything is always looking over the shoulder at philosophy, going like, hey, can we talk about this? Is this philosophizable?
The way things should be.
Yeah, is this the way things should be? And yeah, I love that idea of kind of scrambling that. So it's not that orientation. It's this idea that, and this is not your grandpa's Christianity, it's that Christianity itself is deconstructing, for lack of a better term, itself in its sort of deconstruction of the world in which it finds itself, from which it draws its inspiration to deconstruct itself.
I don't know, man. I think this whole thing is just a huge excuse to do a lot of drugs and be like, yeah, reciprocal co-constitution with the world.
Hey, man, Rambo, right? Deregulation of the senses, dude.
See? My point is made.
Not Rambo. Rambo.
I think Rambo is also Deleuzian.
He might be, dude.
It's just, is there anything else? The bullet's becoming person.
Oh, Jesus. It is. He is becoming animal. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about in particular?
So yeah, let's just quickly talk about the interparticularity idea, because I think this is how he's cashing it out in terms of what does this look like in practice in Christianity.
Oh, real quick, before we get there, because this matters for this, apocalyptic just isn't simply deformation as well. There's also a reformation, and he talks about this in relation to decomposition and recomposition that matters, because it isn't just simply destructive, right? So it's not just Nietzsche philosophizing with a hammer, going in and breaking things down. And this, again, is important for Deleuze. For every deterritorialization, for every scrambling, for every decomposition, for every destruction, there's a reterritorialization, there's a recomposition. So apocalyptic isn't just critical. And that's, I think, really important to understand, because interparticularities imply that there are new formations of particularities. It's just that they aren't going to be these discrete forever units that can be analyzed, but they themselves are in the process of becoming. So I just wanted to say that because I think that's important.
Yeah, there's that strong element of becoming being prior to being in ontology.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the way this cashes out then, Christianity, is referenced by Barber as being like that of John Howard Yoder, who is probably one of the top thinkers in sort of Christian philosophical theology in like 20th century, would you say?
Although he's very problematic, so he's been canceled.
Yeah, he's been canceled since then.
But yes,
there were some unfortunate sexy things, or not so sexy things, happening in his life. Apparently,
yeah. It's worth noting too that Barber was at Duke University working with Stanley Hauerwas and others, and Hauerwas is a Yoderian theologian. So I think it's worth noting that as well.
Yeah, so we'll just kind of put that stuff off to the side for now and say if that's definitely something to look into if you're interested at all in Yoder.
And this book, I think, was written before the Revelations came out.
Yeah, it was. That was just in the last couple of years, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Yoder was... I read The Politics of Jesus back in college. I remember maybe two things about it. But Yoder was following in like the kind of Mennonite Anabaptist tradition, right?
Yeah.
So not one of these, certainly not a Catholic theologian, and certainly not one of the sort of mainstream liberal theologians, and obviously not of the sort of conservative institutional evangelical type. And so that made him very unique in that you don't normally think of the sort of Anabaptist tradition and the Mennonite tradition as really having much of a place for sort of academic theology. They don't usually are not usually involved in the institutions in which academic theology is produced. So that made Yoder very unique. And he's probably best known for articulating an extremely pacifist version of Christianity, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I was very influenced by that actually in my latter undergrad years in kind of like early graduate school work.
Yeah, I remember in early undergraduate years reading Politics of Jesus and probably not understanding the arguments very well, but being very impressed by the sort of embeddedness that pacifism and nonviolence had in a sort of Jesus religion. And that was after 2003 and the Iraq War invasion and all the debates about that, but it certainly retroactively colored how I saw that stuff, because I was just, a high school kid and I didn't really know what was going on. But certainly we were in the midst of being in Iraq and Afghanistan and those debates still continuing when I read that book. So it had a very formative influence on me, even if I don't really remember much of it or consider much of it today. So what is this interparticularity idea then that he's drawing from Yoder?
Let me see. There's a quote here. So it's from Yoder's essay that's called On Not Being Ashamed of the Gospel. And Barber says that Yoder here addresses a tension that inevitably arises in the communication or cultural translation of Christian declaration. So on the one hand, this is still a quote, the demand for communication calls for significative flexibility. So signification, the flexibility of signification, understood as vulnerability to networks of signification that are foreign to those expressive of Christian declaration. And then on the other, there's a demand for integrity that requires attention to ways in which such cultural translation might blunt the specific directives of Christian declaration. So basically, what is the epistemological, or how is it that you kind of understand Christian declaration when you're going into contexts where this is a very sort of different declaration, right? And that's what he means by there has to be sort of significative flexibility. There has to be a vulnerability to these networks of signification that are foreign. So if there's a host world and the Christian declaration is different from that, there's a sense in which there's an awareness that there's a difference, that there's a kind of that there is a way in which there needs to be a relation between these two. So that relates to a universality, right? There needs to be a universality, or there is a universality to the Christian declaration. It's in that relation of the vulnerability or the sensitivity of the Christian declaration to the foreign world in which it is being articulated. But then there's also an sense that there's integrity. There has to be a fidelity to the Christian declaration as a particular discourse or as a particular declaration as well. And it's that tension between the universal and the particular that I think is articulated in this notion of interparticularity. Yes? Is that right?
Yeah, so I mean, some context for this, in debates on religion and the public sphere and politics, there's a term, is Habermas that coined communicative rationality?
Rationality, yeah.
Yeah, and so really, really overly simplified. A popular idea following in the Habermasian tradition is something like the universalization of sort of particular languages needs to happen so that people can sort of participate in a democracy.
Deliberate. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so they need to sort of take off the shell of their religious, the clothing on their religious language and their values and beliefs and whatnot. Get to the kernel that is generic and is shared between different religions and different ideologies. And that's that core is what can be talked about in democracy. And so that's a pretty popular idea. It's probably pretty commensurate with like a kind of a Rawlsian view on liberal egalitarianism as well, although I'm sure that there's some major differences there. And it seems like, even if not explicitly,
yeah, it's kind of an original position sort of thing, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
And so I think that this is very much trying to sort of step away from that and problematize that idea. What I had written down for this section was that Barber's use of Yoder here is saying that the Christian communication definitely shouldn't be about the sort of universal criteria of communication in the Habermasian sense. And it certainly shouldn't try to imperialize Christianity to become the new universal discourse. Obviously, the Anabaptist tradition is diametrically opposed to sort of those large imperial institutions. But it also shouldn't be about the establishment of particular as an exception to the universal. And that was the notion that I was having a little bit of trouble with, or at least wanted to explore a little more. The rationalist and the imperialist Christianity seemed obvious to me, what was being referenced there. But the particular as an exception to the universal, I had written down something like a tradition-focused Christianity. Is this the theological particularism coming back again, do you think?
Say a little bit more about that. What do you mean?
So I think he referenced like Alistair MacIntyre as being a version of the theological particularism, right? Where it's right. Saying that we all have our little traditions, our little language games, and they're not commensurable. You can't do the Habermasian communicative rationality translation game thing. So you just need to stay within your tradition, and you can have, dalliances with those outside your tradition, right? But you can't ever really, truly exchange values. They're sort of isolated communities in some sense. And that was the theological particularism. And he says here that the Yoderian version of the Christian declaration rejects the rationalist and the imperial versions of Christianity, but also this establishment of a particular as an exception to the universal. And I wasn't sure what that meant, if it's anything other than this theological particularism thing from the first chapter.
Yeah. So he talks about this idea of being anti-establishment that he derives from Yoder, right? And because there is this tension between the universal and the particular, between the sort of universal declaration, but also like integrity to the particularity of the Christian declaration, that kind of scrambles the relation between the two. And what he draws from Yoder as an anti-establishment figure is that the principle, and this is a quote, the principle of anti-establishment cuts two ways. He says it cuts both ways. It opposes not just the universal establishment, to which the particularity of Christian discourse might be subjected, which is the Prozorov false universal, right? The idea that it is the universal discourse. No, it opposes that, but it also opposes the particular establishment of Christian discourse, which I do think you're absolutely right, is the theological particularism that allows Christianity to just be its own little micro unit that is completely devoid from or separate from the universal.
And is authentic to some internal identity, which is stable over time. That's the problem, because that doesn't exist.
Right. Exactly. So he says what the principle of anti-establishment seeks to defend is not the particularity that, having already achieved its integrity, stands against the universal, but rather the relationship between particularities. And here he talks about, is it Nathan Kerr, and this idea of dispossession? The problem is that there's no initial possession that is essential in the first instance that any sort of particular Christian discourse emanates from, but that rather there's a kind of like depossession, there's a non-possession, there's, again, this diasporic scrambling that comes to define the Christian declaration in Barber's terms here. It's not issuing from some sort of particular essence that itself is identifiable in its integrity, right?
Yeah, I really liked this because it was kind of like saying all the criticisms that you can level against institutionalized Christianity, the imperial kind and the rationalist kind, can also be leveled against the house churches. Right? They may be better in some areas, right? Obviously they are. But the anti-establishment logic applies to both, because you can establish particulars as exceptions to universal giant imperial institutions as well. They still rely upon a logic of identity. So if you wanted to be a Yodarian, true cult black metal fan, then you need to not only burn down ancient churches, but burn down house churches as well. That's a little inside joke for.
Exactly. No, I like that though. No, that's right. That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. He says Diaspora proceeds by imagining a positive, mutually constitutive relation between the two imperatives, the imperative of the universal and the imperative of the particular. And thus it accedes to a process of interparticular decomposition and recomposition. That's the burning down of the house churches and the creation of the new. The point is that anytime you solidify into a being, you solidify into an identity, it's that moment when scrambling needs to enter, right? And that's how you can think of Christianity as being diasporic. It doesn't matter if it's a universal discourse or if it's a particular discourse that is kind of like serving as the transcendental condition or the regulative condition of the critique. You need to constantly be scrambling or decomposing both, and then of course that will issue into new recompositions and new significations. It reminds me of Foucault's understanding of the historicized a priori, right? So if we're going to think of Kant in terms of like having these a priori categories, for Kant they are these universal absolute a priori categories. But Foucault wants to say, no, but the categories themselves are historicized. They are themselves contingent. And this is something that Barber wants to think of. Historical contingency is not something that we need to bemoan and then try to find some sort of solidity that stops it. But no, we need to just intensify historical contingency, but all around.
Yeah, and so this is where interparticularity comes from, right? It's, again, this reciprocal co-constitution, but here, putting in practice in the Yodarian form would be Christianity is not a self-stable identity that exists over time. It's a thing that has to be in diaspora. It has to find itself inside of a host community, or at least have some sort of other that exists alongside it. And it's going to be affected by that thing as much as that thing is going to be affected by it.
Well, it will only emerge from a host community. It cannot just simply come from nowhere, right? Like, this is precisely why Apocalypse emerges out of the dissatisfaction with covenant ideology. It doesn't just come from nowhere. There is no such thing as like creation ex nihilo here. It's always, this is again the importance of understanding, or maybe not it's not super crucial, but this is where I would want to explore more the idea of the relationship of the virtual and the actual in Deleuze. Because it's if you imagine boundaries like a circle that is drawn, Apocalypse, Diaspora, this notion of interparticularity, it emerges as it's on the margins of that circle, but not outside of that circle, right? Now, it might be that might be a bad spatial metaphor because the circle implies an enclosed totality, and he's thinking outside of that. Immanence is not an enclosed totality, but let's think of totality as being something that is boundless, but nevertheless the process of signification is drawing those boundaries. And that it is in that tension between the boundlessness and the process of signification that is drawing those boundaries that creates that productive tension. And it is precisely at the limits of those significations that is the reservoir for productivity that allows for apocalyptic to become this productive, creative force.
So what happens, though, when Christianity is the host community, like is the current state that we were saying earlier?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I think is precisely what he's going to get into with the relationship between Christian and the secular, right? That Christianity is a host culture of which the secular feeds off of, right? So the secular is maybe, does that make sense?
Yeah, I can see where that might go.
I think he might argue that. I don't know. I mean, I think that that's actually really interesting. Is historically speaking, we would say that Christianity obviously had to emerge out from or from without of a host culture. But what do you do then when Christianity has become the new host culture? I think to truly think of what we can do with Christianity productively, which is what Barber wants to do, is to also then have that sort of like autopoietic decomposition, that the host culture itself needs to kind of also be subject to this notion of the diasporic, right? That will kind of like deconstruct itself. I think that's kind of what we would do.
Man, I haven't heard that word, autopoiesis, in quite a while.
Oh, I love that. It's a good word.
It might be the most jack-off continental philosophy word in existence, though, isn't it?
I know. I used it at least 3 times in my book, so...
Okay, so I think that's pretty good on covering this chapter, yeah?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, is there anything... I wrote at the end, I highlighted a passage and I said, I love this. So this would be my last thing. Is there anything...
the whole book?
Yeah, right. I do. I absolutely do. But so here's the quote. He says, the imposition of Christian signification on the signification of the host culture is not a failed application of Christian declaration. It is the refusal to make this declaration, for it is the refusal to affirm discontinuity. Christian declaration decomposes the already given forms of identity that govern signification, but it is able to compose differential forms, which is the problematized forms, the diasporic forms, only insofar as it submits to the surplus of signification unleashed within the host culture by the liberation of historical contingency from the presumptive forms of necessity that are decomposed. That's kind of a technical way of kind of summarizing everything we said, but I think that kind of encapsulates what he wants to do with Christianity, you know?
Yeah, I think the basic idea in more layman's terms, and you can tell me if I'm getting this right, is
okay.
From several different spheres, whether it's a more conservative, whether it's of the Catholic tradition, whether it's of the evangelical tradition, or of these kind of postmodern emergent churches that are more about ancient future type ideas or sort of recalling the ancient church. All of them have in common this notion of a stable Christian identity. For some of them, like maybe the more imperialist notion, it's Christianity as an institution which can govern the world. For an opposite version, it might be Christianity as little tiny local isolated communities by themselves, engaging in their own locations and never ever getting into this more triumphalist imperialist version. But what they have in common is a Christianity that has a stable identity in some sense, whatever that identity is, however that identity is constituted differently. And Barber wants to reject that and say that the notion of diaspora means that you're always co-constituted by the communities you're embedded in. And then I guess we'll get to the idea of when you're in the group itself, which is the host community, by the smaller communities that are embedded within yours. And a recognition of that kind of contingency of identity, or of the privileging of difference over identity, is necessary to do anything productive with Christianity, because these other forms, for better or worse, are not actually going to be productive with Christianity, or I think understand its relation to secularity properly. That's what we'll get to later.
Yeah, and the stakes for this are eminently political for Barber, because those other forms of Christian discourse try to view themselves as being apolitical, right? That they're talking about being, or they're talking about spirituality, and it's not about politics. Where Barber says, no, that's bullshit. This is absolutely political, because we're talking about signification, which is the construction of meaning and value in a world that is then managed, right? And it's managed in a particular way under particular political regimes. And Christianity, as diasporic, is precisely contesting those political regimes by scrambling the codes of signification, scrambling the codes of meaning and value. So it's essentially a political project, which then is, you can see the Yoderian influence, because for Yoder, what's the name of the book? The Politics of Jesus. It's like, did you ever read that Shane Claiborne book when we were in undergrad that was called like Jesus for President or something like that?
I remember it, but I don't think I read it.
It's kind of a similar thing. It's like, no, if we have a Jesus for president, what that means is he's kind of being tongue-in-cheek. But, you know, Shane Claiborne is all about like building alternative communities. He's kind of like a Christian anarchist, I think, in a lot of ways. But he's precisely contesting, if you will, the political regimes that compose the present world. And there's kind of a diasporic Christianity in that idea that, no, Christianity is sort of going to work within the interstitial spaces, but at the same time, it's going to sort of like work outwardly and actively decompose the present world order. And that's kind of how the politics sneaks in here for Barber. He doesn't talk a lot about politics, but he says that it's eminently political, and I think that it's important to understand that that's always there. Even if he's not talking explicitly about politics or socioeconomic systems or whatever, that's implicit, you know?
Yeah, the politics of Jesus is to be a snarky asshole on Twitter, as we said at the beginning of the podcast. That's political praxis right there. All right, so let's jump into our Sticky Leaves now. The Sticky Leaves section of the podcast is where one of us talks about whatever it is that's giving us meaning in a potentially meaningless world. So, Austin, what's giving it to you this week?
What's giving it to me? You're giving it to me, Troy.
I always give it to you.
You do. I'll keep this pretty quick. I just want to do a sort of 1 year recap on my time here in Sydney. It has been 1 year that I have been in Sydney, Australia. And I figured this would be good because I did a shitty minute on Australia, on Sydney, when I first got here. Remember? And I was kind of...
The one about how everyone's in their little cliques and never talks to each other?
Yeah, and I was kind of confused, like I just didn't quite have it figured out yet. But I want to do a Sticky Leaves now and talk about one of the reasons why I'm falling in love with Sydney. And to kind of encourage people that they should come and check out Sydney. Because I come from a place in Southern California where I never had a desire to come to Sydney because I kind of thought I already have everything that Australia has to offer in Southern California, but without the deadly sharks and snakes and spiders and things like that, right?
Death around every corner, yeah.
Yeah, I was like, I'm good. What do I need? Like, it didn't appeal to me. It wasn't other enough. It wasn't different enough to really, like, inspire me to want to travel here. You know, like, when I travel, I want to go to fucking Europe and see a 1,000-year-old castle, or I want to go to East Asia where I can walk through these ruins of civilizations and experience cultures that are completely different from me. And I've kind of described this in my living journeys through the Anglo world as being familiar but foreign. And so when I got here, it was so familiar that I think I lost some of the excitement and the foreignness that I was anticipating or that I've enjoyed when I lived in Ireland or when I lived in Scotland and when I lived in England and then when I spent my time in Spain. And even though in the Anglo world, you know, they're still speaking English and there's a lot of familiarity with American culture that I'm used to, there was an element, like I said, of that history, that deep history that infused those foreign elements that made it very exciting. But you know what, man? I'm really starting to fall in love with Sydney, and it's less the foreign element, and it's more the familiar element that I'm really starting to get comfortable with. I wish it were a little less humid. I do. I wish there were fewer mosquitoes, which relates to the humidity, I think. But you know, there's a lot that this city has to offer, and I don't just mean like weather and temperature and things like that. And even though I think a lot of like more left-minded and artistically inclined people bemoan a lack of culture and a lack of, I guess what would you call it, like alt culture in Sydney, I've been able to find some really lovely pockets, and I'm really enjoying it. So I would really recommend people to come and to put Sydney on your list if you are going to be exploring like elsewhere in this area, you know, New Zealand, Sydney. I haven't been to Melbourne yet. Everybody tells me that I would actually love Melbourne more because it's kind of got more of that alt culture stuff that I kind of am drawn to, you know, the coffee shops with the weird funky poetry readings and, you know, acid jazz musicians while I'm sitting there reading books on political economy. Like, I love that vibe. But I've found that pocket here in Sydney, and people make fun of me all the time actually because like I kind of stay in my part of town, and like even last night I went to a house party in an area that's called Coogee, which is kind of by the water, and it's like in between this area called Coogee and Randwick, and it was like so new to me that it was actually really exciting because I'm always in the inner west, which is where I live, which is kind of the hipster part of town. And so people always make fun of me. They're like, well, yeah, no wonder you don't really know where anything is and that all of the beach stuff is exciting to you. It's because it's like you are always in Glebe at your coffee shops, just sitting there reading. And I'm like, yeah, I love it there. But I've gotten really comfortable. And then I think one of the things that's been really important and probably the most crucial element to all of this is a really supportive community. And I don't just mean in terms of friends, but actually for me, one of the things I'm starting to realize that I crave more than anything, which is one of the reasons I love doing this podcast so much, is because I need a certain amount of intellectual stimulation every day. And if I don't get it, I actually get bummed out. Like, I'm not as vital, right? And I know that, I talk about like going full death drive, and I've got those hedonist elements in me. Like, fuck, last night I was up getting drunk off wine at a birthday party at this place that I was at, and it was great. But it was also after a day of, I was in a reading group, and I was doing a lot of work. I was reading this book kind of in preparation for today's podcast. I'm working on a journal article. I'm working on a couple of other projects that really kind of gave me some life. And I don't know, like, when I get out of a reading group, or when I get done with a podcast with you, for example, if it's not like super late or something like that at night, and for me it's the morning time, I'm like re-energized and invigorated. And I've found kind of a community and pockets here in Sydney that have facilitated that, and it's just so wonderful. And not everybody needs to find like a philosophy community or a political economy reading group or something like that, but finding those pockets wherever you are that will stimulate your like libidinal flows is so crucial, I think, to finding your joy and happiness. And it's hard. Like, sometimes if you don't have it, it's easy to just kind of wallow in this anti-vitality. I don't know what to call it, but I don't want to say a misery, because it's not a misery per se. It can lead to that. But for me, it's more of there's just a lack of energy. There's a lack of impulse. There's a lack of that bios, the life is not there in me. And I don't know. I just think it's great to find that. And I'm reassessing my time now that it's been exactly 1 year here in Sydney, and I'm loving it. So that's what I want to say. I dig it. I take back my shitty minute.
You're such an extrovert, dude. You get energy from doing all this shit. I'm just tired and want to go to bed, or like watch some basketball or listen to music or something.
See, after a seminar, you don't get invigorated?
No, dude.
Really?
No, I'm intellectually invigorated during the seminar, but afterwards I got to go and just chill and let that stuff like seep in.
Oh gosh.
You just want to go party.
I mean, well, like, I literally got super hyper after this reading group yesterday. I think I mentioned it a couple weeks ago. We're going through this book by Doreen Massey called Spatial Divisions of Labor. And not only was I engaged during, but afterwards I went back to my desk and I felt like crazy. Like, my heartbeat was up, and I was like pacing, and I could just feel I was like so motivated to do more work. That's just kind of how I am. I don't know.
You see,
it's
Sophia,
weird.
goddess of wisdom, and you're just like hearts aflutter, man.
Dude, it's Eros. That's what it is. It is Eros. I need that shit, man. But, so yeah.
I got to come visit you in Sydney, man, before that thing is ever over.
Oh, you do, brother.
What's the best time? When can I avoid all of the 5 foot tall spiders?
Around this time is when it starts to cool down, and so it'll become a little less humid. So this time, and then the winter. I mean, the winter here is like the winter in Southern California. In perfect. Fahrenheit terms, it's like 50, 60 degrees. There'll be a couple days where it gets in the 40s, but it's not bad.
And all the murderous insects and stuff are not roaming about?
Yeah, exactly. I would actually say the fall is really nice. The autumn is really nice. It's this time of year, but not now because we're still kind of summery. I would say, what is this now? I'd say around May time is really nice. Yeah. And of course, spring is great because everything's starting to come back to life after winter, but it can start all of a sudden, like you get a random fucking 100-degree day with 80% humidity. So, but it doesn't seem to happen as much into fall as it's moving into winter.
Alrighty.
Sweet. So I guess that'll go ahead and wrap up the episode for this week. Thank you guys for tuning in. If you want to follow along, you can hit us up on our various social medias. owls_at_dawn on Twitter and Instagram. You can email us, owls@dawnpodcast@gmail.com. You can go to our website, owls@dawn.com. You can look at our back catalog. We've got some blog stuff that's up there, or you can comment under episodes if you have any questions or thoughts or anything you want to contribute. What else, Troy?
And do remember, if you leave us a 5-star rating and review on iTunes and you ask a short and straightforward and simple question in your review, then we will answer it on the air at the beginning of, hopefully, the next episode.
Yeah. Sounds good. All right, man. I think that's pretty much it. Anything else we got to do?
Just one more thing, dude.
What's that, man?
Das Vidania, Amerikanski.